Before there were neon lights and noisy cities, there were quiet mornings tucked within the folds of the Japanese mountains. Long before bullet trains and crowded crossroads, life moved with the rhythm of breath, wind, and bells. In a world far removed from ours, both in space and in spirit, there lived men who chose silence over speech, simplicity over splendor, and stillness over striving. These were the monks of medieval Japan, keepers of quiet wisdom and soft footsteps. Their days were slow, deliberate, and shaped not by ambition but by mindfulness, by the whisper of a bamboo grove or the creak of wooden sandals on stone. In this calming journey through time, we'll step gently into their world. We'll wake before the sun, chant in candlelight, eat with intention, and find peace in the smallest of movements. Tonight, or whenever you're listening, I invite you to slow down too. Let the noise of modern life fade to a hush. Allow your thoughts to quiet. Dim the lights, soften the room, and settle in. If you enjoy stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe, but no pressure at all. I'm glad you're here. Now, take a breath with me. Let your shoulders relax. And together, let's begin our journey into the quiet life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan. In the early hours before dawn, when the air in the mountains of medieval Japan was cool and damp with the breath of mist, the journey of a monk would often begin not with grand ceremony, but with the simple sound of footfalls on a forest path. The world of the Buddhist monk was not entered through gates of gold, nor through triumphant declarations, but rather through humility, the quiet surrender of worldly pursuits, and a willingness to walk away from noise and towards silence. For a young man preparing to join the monastic life, the path would often lead uphill, literally and figuratively. The temples, or Tera, of Zen and Tendai Buddhism were most often built far from villages, nestled into the sides of pine-covered mountains or hidden within the embrace of valleys carved by time. These remote temples served two purposes. First, they removed the monks from distractions, from the bustle of trade, gossip, politics, and desire that clung to the towns below. Second, they brought the monks closer to nature, and by extension, to enlightenment itself. Nature was considered a mirror of the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and monks spent countless hours meditating not just within their halls, but also in the presence of birdsong, flowing streams, and the gentle rustle of bamboo leaves. To live among these natural rhythms was to slowly absorb them, to become attuned to a different kind of time, one not measured in hours, but in the turning of seasons, the growth of moss on stone, the soft fall of snow. Before taking vows, a novice monk, often in his teens, would first undergo a kind of trial period. This was not a test in the way we might think of exams or challenges. Rather, it was a quiet, personal reckoning. Did he have the temperament for the monastic life? Was he willing to rise before the sun, to shave his head, to own nothing, to speak little, and to spend most of his hours in study, ritual, or physical labor? The life of a Buddhist monk was neither glamorous nor easy, but it was rich in a different way, filled with small, meaningful repetitions that shaped the soul. Upon arriving at the temple, the novice would present himself to the abbot, or jishoka. Bowing low, he would offer his request to be accepted as a disciple of the temple. If permitted, he would then begin a period of adjustment, a kind of monastic orientation. His head would be shaved completely, a gesture of renunciation. His robes would be issued, simple, dark garments made of rough-spun fabric, bound at the waist with a plain cord. The act of dressing became, from that moment forward, a ritual of humility, a reminder that identity no longer came from clothing or appearance, but from one's inner practice. The temple itself was a place of stunning simplicity. Its wooden beams, weathered by time and rain, were often unpainted. The floors were swept daily, not for show, but because sweeping was itself a form of meditation. The rooms were sparse, containing little more than tatami mats, low wooden tables, and small altars to the Buddha. Incense burned not for luxury, but to cleanse the air and the mind. Every object in the temple had a purpose, and none existed purely for decoration. This was intentional. Monks were trained to let go of attachment, even to beauty. A typical day for the novice began long before sunrise. A small bell would chime, soft but insistent, echoing through the dark halls. The monks would rise silently, fold away their bedding, and begin their morning ablutions. Water was cold, drawn from mountain springs, and the act of washing the face and hands became another moment of mindfulness. No moment was considered too small for attention. Even brushing away a speck of dust was to be done with care, as though brushing away the dust from one's own heart. The first task of the day was meditation, zazen. In the still, pre-dawn hours, the monks would file into the meditation hall, take their seats on small cushions, and fold their legs into the lotus position. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards or the soft whoosh of fabric. Eyes half lowered, breath slowed, they would sit in stillness, sometimes for hours. The mind, restless at first, would gradually settle. Thoughts would rise and fall like clouds, and the monk would simply observe them without clinging. This was not escapism, but presence, a return to the moment, again and again. After meditation, there was chanting. The monks would gather before the altar and recite sutras in deep, rhythmic voices. The words were ancient, passed down through generations, and often memorized over years of repetition. Chanting served not only as devotion but also as a way to unify the community. Dozens of voices rising and falling in harmony created a sense of shared purpose, a sense of rhythm that carried into every corner of temple life. Meals were an important part of the daily routine, but not for reasons of pleasure or indulgence. Food was prepared and consumed in silence. The ingredients were simple: rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, sometimes tofu. Each dish was eaten slowly, with gratitude. Monks were taught to view eating as a sacred act, not to satisfy craving, but to nourish the body as a tool for practice. Waste was avoided at all costs. Even the water used to rinse bowls was consumed afterward, so that no grain of rice was lost or taken for granted. When meals were done, there was work. The temple was a self-sufficient community, and every monk had duties. Some tended the gardens, pulling weeds, planting vegetables, and raking gravel into delicate patterns. Others chopped firewood, swept paths, repaired roofs, or cleaned floors. These acts were never seen as chores. In fact, they were called samu, work practice, and were considered just as important as meditation. Washing a floor with full attention, with one's whole heart, was just as noble as reciting a sutra. Enlightenment, it was taught, could be found in the smallest action, if done with presence. The rest of the day was filled with study. Monks read sutras, transcribed texts, and received instruction from elder monks. They were taught the teachings of the Buddha, the history of their lineage, and the subtleties of philosophy and ethics. But even study was to be approached without ego. One did not accumulate knowledge to be clever or superior, but to better understand the nature of suffering, impermanence, and compassion. In this way, learning was not about mastery, but about surrender. In the evenings, as the light faded and the hills turned blue with shadow, the temple grew even quieter. Monks gathered again for meditation, sitting in the deepening silence of dusk. The chirp of insects, the call of an owl, the whisper of wind through cedar branches, all became part of the experience. There was no need to escape noise, for nature's sounds were embraced. After meditation came a brief tea ceremony, and then sleep. Mats were unrolled in simple dormitories, and heads laid down in gratitude for another day lived in peace. What might seem repetitive or dull to the modern mind was, to the monk, a gift. There was comfort in the rhythm, freedom in the structure. The day did not ask for excitement, only attention. And slowly, over weeks, months, years, the mind began to settle. The heart grew softer. The world, once loud and demanding, began to seem like a gentle river, flowing, always flowing. For the novice monk, these early days were a time of transformation. He was not expected to be perfect. He was only expected to return, to the breath, to the cushion, to the moment. And in doing so, day by quiet day, he began to walk not just the mountain path to the temple, but the deeper path toward awakening. In the world of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan, time did not tick away in minutes or hours. Instead, it moved like a breeze through pine needles, almost imperceptibly, not rushed, not delayed. There were no ticking clocks or tight schedules to obey. Instead, there were bells. Soft, resonant temple bells that marked the passage of the day with gentle dignity. These bells called monks to meditate, to eat, to work, to rest, not with urgency, but with a subtle invitation. Each toll of the bell was a reminder: come back to the present. Come back to the breath. Come back to now. The daily schedule of a monk was called the jiki, and though it varied slightly by temple and season, it followed a broadly consistent rhythm designed to support mindfulness. Each moment of the day was accounted for, not in the sense of being busy, but in the sense of being purposeful. From the moment a monk awoke, often around 4 a.m., until he returned to sleep after evening meditation, his time was gently structured, like a carefully raked garden. Within that structure there was quiet. Within the quiet, clarity. Mornings began in darkness. The thin walls of the temple let in the cool mountain air, and the stillness of the night lingered as monks slowly rose from their bedding. There was no talking. The day began not with words, but with movement. Bedding was folded neatly. Robes were adjusted and tied with care. The act of waking was not jarring or rushed, it was calm, deliberate. Water was fetched from a spring or basin and used to wash the face and hands. The coldness of the water served as a natural alertness, a grounding ritual that reminded the monk he was alive, present, and capable of practice. After washing, the monks made their way to the zendo, the meditation hall. This sacred space was often a rectangular wooden building with polished floors, open beams, and an altar at one end. Each monk had his assigned seat, a cushion placed just so, with a small wooden block marking his position. Silence continued to reign. One by one, they entered, bowed to the altar, and took their seats. The morning meditation was long, sometimes lasting over an hour. It was not about achieving peace, but about noticing the mind, its wandering, its restlessness, its hopes and regrets, and gently bringing it back to the breath. Inhale. Exhale. Again and again. Once meditation concluded, a bell signaled the beginning of chanting. The monks stood in lines before the altar and recited ancient texts, the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, or other core teachings of the Buddha. These chants were more than words. They were sound vibrations that echoed through the body, anchoring the monks in both tradition and unity. The tone was steady, neither fast nor slow, creating a kind of spiritual rhythm that resonated beyond language. Chanting was not performance, it was presence. Breakfast followed. Known as chashaku, it was a quiet meal, taken in the communal dining hall, called the jikido. Meals in the temple were part of a larger practice known as oryoki, meaning just enough. This was not a buffet or even a hearty spread, it was nourishment, and nothing more. Each monk was given a set of nested bowls, carefully unwrapped and arranged in front of him. The first bowl held rice, the second miso soup, the third vegetables or pickles. Everything was served with intention, received with gratitude, and eaten without distraction. No one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle clink of chopsticks, the shifting of cloth, the faint slurp of soup being savored. Before and after eating, monks would chant again, verses of gratitude for the food, and reminders of why they ate. They did not eat for pleasure or strength, but to sustain the body so it could continue practicing. The final act of the meal involved drinking the rinsed water used to clean the bowls, ensuring that no food or resource was wasted. Cleanliness, mindfulness, and non-attachment, these values were practiced at every turn, even in the act of finishing a meal. Once breakfast was over and the bowls cleaned and repacked, the monks entered the period of samu, work practice. This was where the temple became a kind of living organism, maintained not by servants or staff, but by the monks themselves. Tasks were assigned based on ability, seniority, and rotation. A monk might spend one morning sweeping leaves from stone paths, the next gathering firewood in the forest, and another scrubbing the wooden baths or cooking in the temple kitchen. No task was seen as higher or lower than another. Each was approached with the same calm attention. The work was done in silence. Tools were handled with care. Hands moved slowly, deliberately. A rake became an extension of the body. A mop was not just a mop, but a means of awakening. In Zen tradition especially, the phrase, "chop wood, carry water," symbolized the beauty of the mundane, the idea that enlightenment was not found in exotic rituals or dramatic revelations, but in the simple, repeated actions of daily life. Washing rice could be a form of prayer. Cleaning the latrine could be an act of compassion. By mid-morning, there was a break for tea. This was not the elaborate tea ceremony of the samurai or aristocracy, but a simpler, humbler version. A pot of green tea was brewed and passed among the monks. The warmth of the cup in the hand, the steam rising in the cold air, the bitter taste on the tongue, these were small pleasures, deeply noticed. Again, no words were needed. The tea did the talking. The rest of the morning was often spent in study. Scrolls and books, copied painstakingly by hand, were brought out and read. The teachings of the Buddha, the commentaries of Chinese and Japanese masters, the rules of the monastery, all were studied and memorized over years. Literacy was not widespread in medieval Japan, but monks were among the most educated individuals in society. And yet knowledge was not pursued for power. It was pursued for clarity. Understanding the causes of suffering, the nature of desire, the illusion of permanence. These were the core lessons that shaped every thought and action. Lunch followed study, and it was nearly identical to breakfast. Another oryoki meal, eaten in silence, followed by cleaning and chanting. There was no snacking, no indulgence. In fact, most monks only ate twice a day, morning and noon. The evening hours were reserved for meditation and light herbal tea. This practice of restraint, or shajin, was part of the path to discipline. To hunger, but not grasp. To desire, but not chase. Over time, the body adapted. The mind grew clearer. The senses became sharper. Afternoons were more flexible. Some monks returned to their work duties. Others took part in individual practice, extended meditation sessions, silent walks, or copying sutras by hand. The act of writing, especially in Japanese calligraphy, was itself a spiritual discipline. Each brushstroke required breath control, posture, and focused awareness. The characters were not just ink on paper, they were living symbols, vessels of wisdom. Mistakes could not be erased. One had to accept the imperfection, bow to it, and begin again. By late afternoon, the shadows grew long and the light took on a soft, golden hue. The temple bell chimed again, calling the monks to the hondo, or main hall, for evening service. This session of meditation and chanting marked the closing of the day's formal practice. The energy was different now, slower, more inward. The body was tired, the mind quieter. Sitting in the fading light, surrounded by fellow practitioners, there was a deep sense of stillness. Not emptiness, but fullness, of a very quiet kind. Dinner, when offered, was extremely light, often just a bowl of warm broth or tea. Then, the monks prepared for sleep. There was no entertainment, no idle conversation. Just washing up, folding robes, and returning to their shared sleeping quarters. Mats were rolled out in neat rows. Candles were blown out. And in the cool darkness of the mountain night, the temple became silent once more. Sleep was not an escape from the day, but a continuation of practice. Even in dreams, monks hoped to remain mindful, to observe, not grasp. And so, the rhythm of the day folded gently into the rhythm of night. Breath by breath, step by step, the monks lived lives of gentle repetition and sacred simplicity. To an outsider, it might have seemed monotonous. But to the monk, it was freedom. There were no decisions to make, no ambitions to chase. There was only now. And in that now, there was peace. Among the many practices that shaped the quiet life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan, one of the most profound, and most misunderstood, was the practice of silence. Silence was not simply the absence of speech, nor was it a strict rule imposed to suppress individuality. Rather, it was a cultivated space. A place where truth could echo without distortion, where thoughts could be seen clearly without the noise of unnecessary words, and where the deepest forms of communication, with oneself, with nature, with the Dharma, could unfold. Silence, for the monk, was not a void. It was a path. The Japanese word makusa was often used to describe silent reflection, and it was more than just sitting quietly. It referred to a calm, focused stillness, a silence that radiated not only from the mouth but also from the body and mind. In the temple, silence was not enforced with severity, but with reverence. Young novices quickly learned that to speak less was to hear more. To restrain the tongue was to sharpen awareness. A single word, spoken with intention, held more weight than 1,000 careless ones. This reverence for silence was woven into every part of monastic life. Morning meditation began and ended in silence. Meals were taken without speaking, with gestures used only when absolutely necessary. Work was done quietly, and even during study sessions voices were kept to a whisper, if used at all. In many Zen monasteries, monks went days, weeks, or even months without speaking unless spoken to by a senior. And even then, answers were brief, respectful, and thoughtful. At first, for a novice, this quiet could be disorienting. The world outside the monastery had been filled with chatter, family conversations, market calls, the din of village life. The absence of that noise felt unnatural, even uncomfortable. In the first days of monastic life, the silence seemed to press inward, making the mind's inner noise all the louder. Thoughts raced. Doubts surfaced. The itch to speak, to fill the quiet with reassurance or distraction, grew strong. But slowly, something began to shift. Without the option of expressing every thought aloud, monks were forced to observe those thoughts. To notice how quickly the mind jumped from one thing to another. To watch how emotions rose and fell like tides. Over time, this observation became a kind of wisdom. Silence revealed the texture of the mind, the currents beneath the surface. A monk began to recognize which thoughts were fleeting, which were rooted in craving or fear, and which were worth tending. The voice that mattered most was no longer the one spoken, but the one heard within. Silence also cultivated humility. Without the ability to impress others with words, status became less important. Without the constant back and forth of casual conversation, ego had fewer places to hide. Each monk became, in a sense, equal, not in skill or experience, but in presence. They were not trying to outshine one another, but to outgrow their own illusions. This did not mean that speech was forbidden. There were times when speaking was necessary, during instruction, correction, or ritual. The abbot might give a Dharma talk, explaining a difficult teaching or guiding the monks through a challenge in their practice. A senior monk might offer advice to a struggling novice. But even these moments were shaped by restraint. The speech was slow, clear, and never wasted. The Buddhist precept of right speech, one of the elements of the Eightfold Path, guided every word. Speak only what is true, helpful, timely, and kind. Even humor, though rare, had its place, offered quietly, in the right moment, to ease tension or offer perspective. There are stories from Zen tradition of monks laughing softly at their own mistakes or smiling during long meditations, not out of amusement, but from a deep awareness of the absurdity of clinging to thought. These moments of gentle laughter were not disruptions but reminders. Don't take the self too seriously. There were also formal practices that embraced silence more intensely. One such practice was session, a multi-day meditation retreat in which monks would sit for hours at a time, day after day, in complete silence. During session, even gestures were minimized. Meals were eaten mindfully, walks were slow and deliberate, and the mind was brought again and again to the breath. These retreats were both physically demanding and spiritually clarifying. By stripping away all distractions, session forced a monk to sit face to face with the mind, to see its habits, its resistance, its illusions, and to soften them through awareness. Silence was not only practiced individually, but communally. The silence of the temple was a shared agreement, a group effort. When one monk moved quietly, others followed. When a novice forgot and spoke out of turn, a senior monk might gently place a finger to his lips, not as a reprimand, but as a reminder. Silence was not enforced through shame, but through example. And so, a kind of harmony emerged. A peaceful hum that permeated the halls, gardens, and rooms of the temple, not sound, but presence. The architecture of the monastery supported this atmosphere. Corridors were made of wood that creaked softly underfoot, reminding one to walk with care. doors slid open with a sigh rather than a slam. Gardens were designed for contemplation, with winding paths and stone arrangements that invited stillness. Even the placement of windows was intentional, allowing light to enter slowly, casting gentle patterns on the floor. These details, though subtle, helped create an environment where silence felt natural, even nourishing. Outside the monastery, the world often misunderstood this quiet. To many in medieval Japan, monks were mysterious, their silence seen as aloofness, their stillness as idleness. But those who visited the temples for guidance or healing often left changed. They found in the monks not just calmness, but clarity. Not just silence, but depth. The absence of noise allowed truth to emerge, gently, like fog lifting from a pond. Even writing, when used, reflected this discipline. Monks who copied sutras or wrote in personal journals did so slowly, with elegant strokes and precise intention. Each character was a meditation. There was no rush to finish, no pride in showing off. The act of writing was just another expression of mindfulness, another way to dwell in silence, even while communicating. The relationship between silence and discipline was foundational to a monk's training. It was not enough to be quiet. One had to be inwardly still. This required effort, a gentle, consistent effort to return again and again to awareness. Discipline was not harsh or rigid, but steady. It was the discipline of a tree growing toward light, or a river following its course. It was the kind of effort that softened over time, becoming part of the monk's nature. Over months and years, silence began to change the monk. He no longer feared pauses or emptiness. He no longer sought constant stimulation. He found joy in the flutter of a bird's wing, the crackle of a fire, the sound of his own breath. He began to hear the world differently, not louder, but deeper. Conversations became richer, because they were rare and intentional. Relationships became more honest, because they were built not on performance, but on presence. And so, in the quiet halls of a mountain temple, a monk learned one of the deepest truths of the path: that silence is not an escape from life, but a return to it. In silence, he discovered the sound of his own heart. In silence, he met the world not with judgment, but with stillness. And in that stillness, he found peace. To walk through a monastic garden in medieval Japan was to enter a living sutra, a silent scripture written in stone, moss, water, and air. For the Buddhist monks who cultivated and cared for these sacred spaces, gardens were not simply ornamental or recreational. They were an extension of the practice, a mirror of the mind, and a teacher in stillness. Every rock, every ripple of sand, every carefully pruned pine was placed with intention, not to impress the eye, but to point inward, toward clarity, impermanence, and peace. Many temples in medieval Japan followed Zen design principles in their gardens, especially in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods when Zen Buddhism was at its height. These gardens were not lush or overflowing with flowers. Instead, they were spare, deliberate, and poetic. Called karasansui, or dry landscape gardens, they often featured raked gravel or sand meant to represent water, with larger rocks suggesting mountains or islands. Moss grew freely, tracing the contours of age and moisture. Small bridges, stone lanterns, and bamboo fences added quiet accents. And beyond the visible, there was always space, the unseen, the empty, the pause, as important as the forms themselves. A young monk assigned to garden duty might begin his morning just as the sun kissed the treetops, when the air was cool and dew clung to every leaf. His tools were few: a bamboo rake, a pair of shears, and his own breath. The gravel needed raking, not just to maintain its appearance, but to express mindfulness. Each line drawn in the sand was a reflection of his mental state. Was it smooth and even? Or did it wobble, like a distracted thought? The act of raking was not about control, it was about harmony. A single misplaced footprint in the gravel was not a mistake, but an invitation to begin again. Gardening was never hurried. The monks knew there was no destination to reach, no perfect version of the garden to attain. It was always in process, like the mind. A weed pulled here, a stone adjusted there, a leaf swept gently from a moss bed. These small acts accumulated into a quiet conversation with nature. And nature, in turn, responded with subtle teachings that growth takes time, that decay is natural, and that beauty does not cling. The plants chosen for temple gardens were modest. Evergreen pines symbolized endurance. Bamboo represented flexibility and resilience. Plum trees, which bloomed even in the chill of winter, stood for perseverance and quiet strength. Seasonal flowers like camellia or iris might appear in small numbers, never dominating the scene. The emphasis was always on balance, asymmetry, contrast, and space. The monks learned that emptiness was not lack, but potential. A bare patch of gravel held just as much meaning as a flowering branch. In many temples, a small pond was included, its surface glassy and still. Koi fish moved slowly beneath the water, their colors muted and graceful. The reflection of the sky shifted hour by hour, reminding the monks that nothing remained the same. A single drop of rain would ripple outward, disturbing the surface, just as a stray thought could disturb meditation. But then, the water would settle again, just as the mind could. Beyond the aesthetic and philosophical aspects, gardens were also places of healing. A monk troubled by doubt, fatigue, or grief might take a walk along the winding paths, his sandals brushing softly against stone. The sound of wind in the bamboo, the scent of cedar, the sight of a dragonfly landing on a rock, these were not distractions from practice, but practice itself. Nature offered comfort without words. The garden was a listener, a space where the heart could open without judgment. Sometimes monks would sit for hours on a wooden bench overlooking the garden, doing nothing. Not meditating, not analyzing, just being. Watching the light change. Listening to the birds. Feeling the warmth of the sun or the coolness of shade. In a culture that often prized action and effort, this quiet receptivity was radical. And yet, it was in these moments of still presence that many monks reported their deepest insights. Even the changing seasons were part of the garden's teaching. In spring, new shoots emerged, fresh green against dark soil. In summer, the foliage deepened, thick and rich. In autumn, the leaves turned brilliant red and gold, then fell. And in winter, the garden became bare, stripped to its bones. Each season offered a lesson in impermanence and letting go. The monks did not try to preserve the garden in one ideal state. They tended it with acceptance, allowing it to change, knowing that change was the only constant. In Zen tradition, the phrase, Shun Jiei, meaning, spring comes of itself, reminded monks that the world moved in cycles, and their only task was to align themselves with those cycles. There was no need to force, to strive, to rush. Just as the garden bloomed when the time was right, so too would understanding arise when the mind was ready. The connection between the garden and the self was often expressed in metaphor. A monk's mind, said the elders, was like a wild field at first, overgrown with desire, fear, and illusion. But with practice, that field could be tended. The weeds could be removed, the soil enriched, the paths cleared. In time, the mind became like the garden, ordered but alive, shaped but not rigid, beautiful but humble. And just as the garden welcomed all who entered, so too would the monk's heart, spacious, grounded, and open. The role of gardener rotated among the monks, but some took to it deeply, making it a lifelong devotion. These monks became attuned to the subtlest changes, a shift in the soil's scent, a curl in a leaf, the pattern of morning frost. They learned to read the garden like a scroll. And in doing so, they learned to read themselves. The outer world reflected the inner. Each branch held a lesson. Each stone had a place. There were even rituals associated with the garden, small ceremonies to mark the planting of a new tree, the raking of the first frost, the blooming of the first plum blossom. These rituals were simple, sometimes involving just a bow, a word of thanks, or a moment of silence. But they carried weight. They reminded the monks that even the smallest moments were sacred. At times, lay visitors would come to the temple and gaze at the garden, marveling at its simplicity and serenity. Some would ask the monks for its meaning. But the monks would only smile gently and suggest they sit and watch. The garden could not be explained. It had to be experienced. And in that experience, each visitor found something different, a memory, a peace, a question, a release. The garden, like the Dharma, offered no single answer. But it did offer a path. A way of seeing, a way of being. And for the monk who raked its gravel each morning, who trimmed its trees and swept its paths, the garden became a living teacher, patient, silent, and infinitely wise. In this space of green and stone, of light and shadow, the monk learned to listen without needing to respond, to tend without needing to control, and to exist without needing to prove. And in doing so, he discovered the essence of the path, not escape from the world, but deep, loving attention to it. In the quiet, wooden halls of the monastery, where the scent of sandalwood lingered and the paper walls glowed softly with filtered light, monks spent countless hours engaging in an activity that was as sacred as it was silent, the study and transcription of sutras. These were not mere academic exercises or clerical duties. They were acts of devotion, reflection, and transformation. In the monastic world of medieval Japan, the sutra was more than a book. It was a bridge, connecting the individual to the Buddha, the past to the present, the seen to the unseen. The word sutra comes from the Sanskrit for thread, and it was believed that each line of a sutra was a thread leading the reader toward understanding, woven from the teachings of the Buddha himself. Japanese monks preserved and studied hundreds of these texts, some translated from Chinese, others copied by earlier generations of Japanese scholars. The most well-known, such as the Heart Sutra, Lotus Sutra, and Diamond Sutra, were studied with particular reverence, memorized line by line, chanted aloud, and copied by hand with brush and ink. The act of copying a sutra was called shakyo, and it was far more than a task of replication. It was a meditation. A monk would prepare for shakyo much like he would for zazen. He would wash his hands, bow before the altar, and set his mind into stillness. Only then would he sit down before a long sheet of washi paper, handmade, slightly textured, and pristine. His brush was cut bamboo, its tips soft and responsive. The ink was made from soot and pine oil, ground slowly on a stone until it reached a perfect consistency. Each character was painted one by one, slowly, intentionally, with the breath guiding the hand. There was no rush to complete the page, no pressure to decorate or embellish. Precision mattered, but so did presence. The shape of the stroke reflected the shape of the mind. A wobbly line revealed distraction. A fluid one calm. The monk's goal was not to make a perfect copy, but to embody the teaching in the act of copying it. In this way, the sutra was not just read, it was lived. Mistakes were not erased. They were acknowledged. A drop of ink out of place was not seen as failure, but as part of the practice, a chance to notice, to accept, to return to center. Just as in meditation, the mind might wander, just as in chanting, the voice might falter. In shakyo, imperfection was expected, and compassion applied to oneself was just as important as precision applied to the page. In some temples, completed sutras were kept in sacred scroll libraries, organized by size and school. Others were buried in small pagodas, sent into rivers as offerings, or enshrined in miniature stupas. There was a belief that each written word carried merit, not only for the writer, but for all beings. Copying a sutra was seen as an act of healing, a gift to the world, a ripple of mindfulness that extended beyond the monastery walls. Young novices often began their studies with the Heart Sutra, a short but profound text that explored the nature of emptiness and form. It was simple in structure, but endlessly deep in meaning. A novice might spend years copying and studying it, not because he didn't understand it, but because each reading revealed something new. The words did not change, but the monk did. And so, the sutra remained fresh, like morning dew on a familiar path. Study was often done in pairs or small groups. Senior monks would sit with juniors, reading aloud, questioning gently, encouraging curiosity. There was no competition, no grading, no ranks of intelligence. Instead, there was mutual respect, an understanding that wisdom did not come from intellect alone, but from sincerity of heart. A monk who asked honest questions was seen as more advanced than one who recited answers by rote. Beyond the literal content of the sutras, monks also studied the commentaries, the reflections and explanations written by earlier masters. These commentaries were treasured, offering glimpses into the minds of monks who had lived centuries before. A single line of commentary might be the subject of an entire evening's discussion. What did it mean to see without seeing? How could one listen to the silence? These paradoxes were not meant to confuse, but to stretch the mind, to nudge it beyond conventional thought. There was also an oral component to study. The abbot, or jishoku, might give weekly Dharma talks, gathering the monks to listen and reflect. These talks were delivered slowly, often beginning with a story, a parable about a monk, a bird, a teacup, followed by commentary. The lessons were not didactic or rigid. They invited contemplation, offering multiple layers of meaning. A story that seemed humorous on the surface might, upon reflection, carry a lesson about attachment or fear. Some monks kept private journals, not of daily events, but of insights, confusions, and prayers. These journals, often hidden away in drawers or tucked beneath futons, became records of inner growth. A line might read, "Today I saw the impermanence in the fall of a single leaf." Another might confess, "I fear I still crave approval." These writings were never shared, never judged. They were conversations with the self, honest, raw, and tender. In the larger scriptural tradition, calligraphy was also an art form in its own right. A skilled monk might be asked to create large scrolls to hang in the temple or to send to patrons. These scrolls were not decorative, they were blessings. A single character, written with perfect balance and energy, could carry as much power as an entire sermon. The brush, like the voice, became a channel for the Dharma. The temple library was a place of both reverence and warmth. Scrolls were stored in wooden cases, wrapped in silk, and handled with care. The scent of old paper mixed with incense. Time passed slowly in these rooms. Monks sat cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud in low voices, tracing characters with their fingers, or simply resting their hands on the pages in silent gratitude. Knowledge was not hoarded. It was shared freely, passed down like a flame, each monk a temporary guardian of wisdom far older than himself. Language, for the monk, was not an end, but a tool, a raft to cross the river of confusion. And once the crossing was complete, even the raft was to be left behind. This was a teaching from the Buddha himself: cling not to the words, but to the meaning behind them. A monk could memorize every sutra and still miss the point if his heart remained closed. But a single sentence, deeply understood, could transform a life. Thus, the art of the sutra was not just about study. It was about surrender. To copy a line was to bow to it. To read a passage was to invite it into the body. To discuss a phrase was to risk being changed by it. And in this gentle, ongoing process, the monk found not just knowledge, but a kind of freedom, a release from the noisy opinions of the world, and a return to something quieter, deeper, truer. In the stillness of a temple hall, beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp, a monk dipped his brush into ink and began again. One character, one breath, one moment at a time. In a life governed by quiet reflection and humble routine, sound played a unique and sacred role in the daily rhythm of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan. But this was not the everyday noise of the outside world: no market calls, no clatter of carts, no shouting over crowds. In the monastery, sound was rare and intentional. And because it was rare, it carried great meaning. Whether it was the low hum of morning chants, the soft ring of a handbell, or the deep resonance of a temple gong, each sound was part of a larger devotion, a living reminder of impermanence, presence, and the connection between all things. The day began, not with voices, but with a bell. Known as the Kansho or Bansho, the temple bell was large and cast in bronze, often suspended from a wooden frame near the entrance of the monastery. It did not chime like a Western bell. Instead, it was struck from the outside with a suspended log, producing a deep, rounded tone that lingered in the air like mist over water. The first bell of the day was sounded in the darkness before dawn, signaling the monks to rise. It was not an alarm, but an invitation, a gentle summons to return to the path, to begin again. These bells, often inscribed with sutras and prayers, were not just functional tools. They were spiritual instruments, believed to carry the teachings of the Buddha into the air with every strike. The resonance was thought to purify the mind, calm the heart, and even ward off misfortune. A monk might pause mid-step to listen, bow his head, and feel the vibration ripple through his bones. It was a sound that connected the body to the spirit, the present to the eternal. Following the bell, the monks moved quietly to the meditation hall for zazen, and then to the main hall for morning chanting. Chanting, or shomyo, was one of the most powerful and communal expressions of devotion. Unlike private reading or silent reflection, chanting brought the entire sangha, the community of monks, together in voice. Their tones did not rise in melody, but in deep, rhythmic unity. The sutras were recited slowly, syllable by syllable, in a cadence that synchronized breathing and bound the group in spiritual harmony. Each syllable was pronounced with care. The tone was low, steady, and focused not on performance but on presence. Monks sat or stood in rows, their hands in gas show, palms pressed together in prayer, their robes flowing like shadows in the dim light. Candles flickered. Incense smoke curled toward the rafters. The combined sound of their voices created a kind of sonic landscape, not loud, but vast, stretching beyond the walls of the temple, as if touching the unseen. Some chants were short, repeated many times like mantras. Others were long and elaborate, requiring memorization and careful pacing. The Heart Sutra, one of the most frequently chanted texts, was both simple and profound. Its central phrase, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," was repeated with deep reverence, its paradox resonating both intellectually and spiritually. To chant it was to enter its mystery, not to solve it. In some temples, the role of chant leader rotated among the monks. This role, known as the jikido, carried great responsibility. The chant leader set the tone, pace, and rhythm. He had to be clear, steady, and deeply focused, not because others followed him out of duty, but because a waver in his voice could shake the entire group's meditation. It was a subtle leadership, built not on authority, but on presence. A strong voice did not mean a loud one, but a centered one. Chanting was also used to mark transitions throughout the day, before meals, after meditation, at the beginning and end of work practice. A short verse might be recited before eating. We reflect on the effort that brought us this food, and consider how it comes to us. We reflect on our virtue and conduct, and whether we are worthy of this offering. These chants served as reminders, grounding each action in gratitude and mindfulness. Sacred instruments often accompanied chanting. Small bells, known as rin, were struck with padded sticks to signal the beginning and end of a chant. Their pure, crystalline tone cut through thought like sunlight through mist. Wooden blocks called makujio, carved in the shape of fish, a symbol of wakefulness, were struck rhythmically during longer sutras. The hollow, echoing sound of the makujio created a heartbeat for the chant, keeping the monks aligned in time and breath. Rituals were another vital part of monastic life, and they too were grounded in sound. One of the most moving was the morning offering, or chohai, a short service of incense, chanting, and bows performed before the temple altar. This ritual was a daily reminder of the monk's vows and of the presence of the Buddha in all things. Bowing, an act of deep humility, was not rushed. It was slow, with the forehead touching the floor, the body surrendering to reverence. No words were spoken. Only breath, only intention. Seasonal ceremonies brought more elaborate rituals. The Obon festival in late summer honored the spirits of ancestors, with lanterns, incense, and extended chanting. The Rohatsu session, a week-long retreat in December, commemorated the Buddha's enlightenment. During this intense practice, monks sat in meditation for long hours each day and chanted special sutras into the night. Fatigue became part of the offering. Sound became a lifeline, lifting the spirit when the body grew weak. Even funerals and memorial services were conducted with chanting, not in sadness, but in acknowledgement. The chants were not cries of mourning, but recitations of wisdom, offered to the living and the dead alike. The belief was that the sound of sutras could help guide the departed toward peace, just as it guided the living toward understanding. The architecture of the temple supported this acoustic world. High ceilings, wooden floors, and paper walls created a soft, resonant environment. Footsteps were heard, but gently. Voices did not echo loudly, but traveled with a kind of intimacy. The temple was designed to amplify awareness, not noise. And because sound was so carefully managed, its presence always meant something. Silence, in turn, gained even more power. Because sound was sacred, its absence was too. The pauses between chants, the breath between verses, the stillness after a bell, these spaces were not empty. They were full of potential. They were invitations to listen more deeply, not just with the ears, but with the heart. To live in this environment was to develop a different relationship with sound. One no longer sought music or chatter for comfort. One began to crave simplicity, the hush of wind, the chirp of a bird, the faint knock of bamboo in the breeze. Even one's own voice, when finally used, carried more weight. Words became tools of clarity, not noise. And in time, the monk began to hear things he hadn't noticed before. The way his breath moved in his chest. The creak of the meditation cushion beneath him. The distant rustle of leaves. The tone of another monk's voice, not just the words, but the feeling behind them. Chanting had tuned his ears to the subtle, the sincere. Thus, through the ritual use of sound, and the reverence of silence, the monk was constantly reminded of the Dharma, that all things arise and fall away, that nothing is fixed, that even the voice fades. And yet, in the fading, there is beauty. In the echo, there is truth. Each day, the bell rang. Each day, the monks chanted. And each day, the sound dissolved into silence again, like waves returning to sea, like breath returning to stillness, like the self returning to what it always was, present, listening, awake. In the daily life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan, food was not just sustenance for the body. It was a lesson in discipline, a practice in gratitude, and a reflection of deeper truths. Eating was not about indulgence or comfort. It was not a break from spiritual life, but part of it. Each bite, each bowl, each meal was treated with the same mindfulness as meditation or chanting. The monastery's kitchen, or kuri, was a sacred space, and the preparation and consumption of meals were woven into the spiritual fabric of the day. Meals were simple, seasonal, and deeply symbolic. They reflected the Buddhist principle of ahimsa, non-harming, and so no meat or animal products were used. The monastic diet, known as Shajin Ryuri, was plant-based and designed to be as nourishing as it was ethical. It aligned with the 5 precepts and supported the monk's pursuit of clarity and compassion. Every ingredient was chosen with care, every dish prepared with intention, and every serving offered with humility. The day's first meal came shortly after the morning meditation and chanting. Known as chashaku, it typically consisted of warm rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, and perhaps a small portion of tofu or seaweed. Each monk was provided with a set of nested wooden bowls, wrapped carefully in cloth and tied with string. This personal set, called oryoki, was a ritual in itself. The process of unwrapping the bowls, arranging them in a specific order, and cleaning them afterward was just as important as the food they held. The monks ate in silence, seated in straight rows on tatami mats in the dining hall. A chant preceded the meal, a reflection on the origins of the food, the labor that brought it, and the responsibility of receiving it with a pure heart. It reminded the monks that the food was not a reward, but a tool for continued practice. We reflect on our conduct, the chant would say, and ask if we are worthy of this offering. Food was served by designated monks who moved slowly down the rows with large bowls, ladling portions into each monk's oryoki set. No one reached out or gestured. They simply raised their hands in a respectful signal, palms facing up, when they were ready to receive. Portions were modest, never more than needed. Seconds were rarely offered unless there was food remaining after everyone had been served. There was no talking during the meal. No requests. No complaints. Only the sound of chopsticks and the occasional swallow. Eating slowly, mindfully, was the rule. The monk was taught to notice the texture of the rice, the warmth of the soup, the saltiness of the pickles. In this focused attention, the act of eating became meditation. It was a way of acknowledging the interconnectedness of all things, from the farmer who grew the rice, to the monk who cooked it, to the earth that bore it. After the meal, a small amount of hot water was poured into the bowls. The monks used a special piece of cloth and a small wooden stick to rinse and clean each bowl, drinking the rinse water afterward. This ensured that no grain of rice was wasted, no trace of food discarded. The bowls were dried, re-nested, and wrapped again, ready for the next meal. This process emphasized the values of simplicity, frugality, and deep appreciation. The midday meal, or chishoku, was similar in structure and content. It was considered the main meal of the day and often included seasonal vegetables, stewed root dishes, or fermented items like natto. Occasionally, monks might receive noodles or porridge, especially in colder months. Yet even these variations were modest, never indulgent. The food was prepared in a way that respected its natural flavor. Little seasoning was used. The idea was not to excite the senses, but to calm them. Between these two meals, monks did not snack. Hunger was expected, even embraced. It was considered part of the discipline. Desire, including the desire for food, was seen as a form of suffering, and learning to observe it without acting on it was a step toward liberation. Instead of reaching for comfort, a monk learned to sit with discomfort, to breathe through it, to understand that the body's cravings were not commands, but passing clouds in the sky of the mind. Evening brought no formal meal. Some temples allowed a light broth or herbal tea before bed, especially for the elderly or infirm. But most monks fasted from noon until the following morning. This was not extreme. It was balanced. The body adjusted over time, and the clarity that came from an empty stomach was seen as a gift. Fasting was a form of purification, not just physical, but spiritual. On special occasions, such as the changing of seasons or temple festivals, the meals might be slightly more elaborate. A monk might receive a piece of fruit, a sweet rice ball, or a dish prepared with extra care. But even then, the principle of non-attachment applied. These foods were not to be anticipated or remembered longingly. They came and went like everything else. The joy was not in the food itself, but in the ability to receive it mindfully, and then let it go. Cooking, too, was a practice of devotion. The monk assigned to the kitchen, called the tenzo, held one of the most respected roles in the temple. The Tenzo Kaikan, a 13th century manual written by the Zen master Dogen, offered precise instructions for this role, not just in terms of recipes, but in attitude. Treat even a single grain of rice with the respect of gold, Dogen wrote. Do not waste, do not complain. Cook with the heart of a parent, caring for the Sangha as you would for your own children. The Tenzo rose early, long before the others, to prepare the morning meal. He worked quietly, often alone, chopping vegetables with mindful precision, stirring pots without haste, sweeping the floor as a form of prayer. Ingredients were laid out like offerings, tools cleaned and placed just so. Nothing was thrown away carelessly. Vegetable scraps were composted, water was reused when possible, and even the peels of root vegetables were used in broths. Waste was considered disrespectful, not just to the food, but to the practice itself. New monks learned quickly that the kitchen was not a place for idle chatter. It was a place of reverence. One could gain insight by peeling a carrot, wisdom by stirring a pot. The heat of the stove was not a burden, but a purifier. The steam rising from a bowl was not just moisture, but a reminder of impermanence. In cooking, as in all things, the process mattered more than the product. Visitors to the temple were sometimes offered meals, usually in silence, in the same style as the monks. Many found the simplicity shocking at first. Where was the flavor? Where was the variety? But after a few days, something changed. Palates adjusted. Sensitivity returned. A simple bowl of rice began to taste sweet. A radish pickled in brine revealed subtle complexities. And the absence of noise, both literal and mental, allowed for a new kind of satisfaction, not fullness of the stomach, but fullness of awareness. There were no feasts, no indulgences, no second helpings. And yet, the monks never went hungry in spirit. Their nourishment came from the rhythm of their practice, the purity of their intention, and the humility with which they received each offering. In this way, eating became more than just a necessity. It became a sacred exchange, between the earth and the body, between effort and gratitude, between form and emptiness. And so, day after day, year after year, the monks of medieval Japan sat cross-legged with their bowls, not seeking pleasure, not avoiding discomfort, but simply being present. One bite, one breath, one moment at a time. The monastery in medieval Japan was more than a place of residence. It was a carefully constructed world unto itself, a sacred container for the life of mindfulness. Every beam of wood, every curve of a roof, every garden path and temple gate was shaped with intention, not for splendor or display, but to support the monk's journey inward. In its silence, its symmetry, and its simplicity, the monastery was both refuge and teacher, a space that whispered the Dharma through the soft creak of its floorboards and the slow shift of sunlight on a paper wall. From the moment a monk crossed the threshold of the temple grounds, he entered a space set apart. The boundary was not only physical but spiritual. Many monasteries were nestled into mountainsides, surrounded by forest, or perched on ridgelines where clouds drifted low and birdsong echoed through pines. Others stood at the edge of rural villages, removed just enough from the bustle of daily life to maintain their contemplative silence. The location of a monastery was not chosen at random, it reflected the teachings it housed. Closeness to nature, elevation from the ordinary world, and distance from distraction were all key. The entrance was often marked by a sanman, a large, wooden gate that symbolized the threshold between the secular and the sacred. Passing through it was an act of letting go. The monk would bow before entering, a physical reminder to leave ego, attachments, and the noise of the outer world behind. Once inside, the atmosphere changed. Footsteps quieted. Voices hushed. The world slowed down. The layout of the monastery followed a traditional design, often inspired by earlier Chinese and Indian Buddhist temples, but uniquely adapted to the Japanese landscape and aesthetic. The most important buildings were arranged in alignment, usually along a central axis. At the heart of the complex stood the Hondo, or main hall, where statues of the Buddha resided and important rituals were held. This building was large, wooden, and open, not cavernous, but spacious, with high beams, a polished floor, and an altar adorned with candles, incense, and offerings. Here, monks gathered for ceremonies, communal chanting, and teachings. The Hondo was the spiritual anchor of the monastery, and its architecture reflected that. The proportions were balanced. The air was cool and lightly scented. Natural light filtered in through paper-covered windows, creating a soft glow that shifted throughout the day. Nothing was excessive. The beauty lay in restraint. To one side of the Hondo was the Zendo, or meditation hall. This was the most sacred space for personal practice. It was long and rectangular, with rows of zafu cushions placed along the walls. Each monk had a designated spot. There were no decorations, no distractions. Only silence and breath. The floors were scrubbed daily, and the wooden walls bore the marks of time, a worn patch where a hand always reached, a slight dip in the boards where footsteps always passed. These marks were not flaws but history, the quiet evidence of years of practice. Adjacent to the Zendo was the kuri, the monastery kitchen. Though humble in appearance, it was a central hub of activity and care. The kitchen embodied the principle that nourishment was a form of compassion. Wooden counters, iron kettles, stone stoves, and long-handled ladles were arranged with precision. Steam rose gently from pots, and the scent of miso or simmering greens drifted softly into the halls. Every action, from chopping to stirring to serving, was done with attention. The monks' sleeping quarters, or sobo, were communal and minimal. Thin mats were laid out in neat rows each night, and rolled up in the morning. There were no personal belongings aside from robes, bowls, and sometimes a small book or journal. Privacy was not a goal. Instead, there was a quiet intimacy, a shared understanding. The space was clean, not sterile, modest, not cold. A single lantern might cast a circle of light, while beyond it, the room faded into shadow. The walkways that connected each building were covered but open to the air. These corridors, narrow, wooden, and slightly elevated, creaked underfoot and smelled faintly of cedar. Walking them was not just transit, but transition. From practice to study. From ritual to rest. Each step became an opportunity to return to mindfulness. In rainy seasons, the monks walked barefoot, the boards slick and dark with moisture. In winter, they wrapped their robes tighter against the cold and moved more slowly. The elements were not avoided. They were embraced. Gardens were integrated throughout the monastery grounds, not only in designated courtyards but in small corners between buildings, behind the kitchen, or near the laundry. Moss grew freely, climbing up stone lanterns and along shaded walls. Small trees twisted gently in the breeze, and gravel paths wound through clusters of rocks like quiet streams. These gardens were not places of escape, but of return, mirrors of the monk's own internal landscape. The architecture itself taught the Dharma. The impermanence of all things could be seen in the weathering of the wood, the fading of paper screens, the soft groan of a beam long settled into place. The law of cause and effect was visible in the drip of rain carving channels in stone. The principle of non-attachment was echoed in the fact that nothing was locked, nothing hoarded. If a monk left, his bedding was rolled up and his place quietly reassigned. Even the scale of the buildings was deliberate. Nothing towered. Nothing loomed. The structures invited reverence, not awe. They blended into the landscape rather than dominating it. The roofs, often curved upward at the ends, were layered with tiles that sang softly in the rain. Eaves extended far beyond the walls, offering shelter and emphasizing shadow, a key feature in Japanese aesthetics. The interplay of light and dark, of form and emptiness, was part of the architectural language. In the evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the monastery took on a different mood. The golden light spilled across floors and through open doors. Candles were lit. The smell of incense deepened. The world seemed to exhale. The sounds grew softer, a broom sweeping, the clink of a pot lid, the whisper of robes. The buildings, quiet by day, now seemed to listen. There were no paintings on the walls, no statues save those at the altars. The monastery was not filled with images, but with space. This space was not emptiness in the Western sense, it was potential, breath, a pause between thoughts. The architecture did not ask to be admired. It asked to be entered, inhabited, felt. It guided without dictating. It supported without demanding. And so, as the monk moved from one hall to another, from morning to night, from season to season, he came to know the monastery not just as a place, but as a path. It became a companion in practice, silent, steady, sheltering. Its walls did not preach, but they reminded. Its floors did not instruct, but they received every step with patience. Its doors did not close off the world, but opened onto a deeper version of it. In time, the monk began to reflect the very structure he lived in, grounded, simple, open, and calm. He became, in his own way, a monastery, a body containing silence, a voice shaped by wisdom, a life made sacred not by what it held, but by what it let go. The life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan did not unfold against a static backdrop. It was deeply attuned to the turning of the seasons, the slow unfolding of spring, the full breath of summer, the quiet decay of autumn, and the deep stillness of winter. These were not simply changes in weather or temperature. They were spiritual seasons as well, each one offering its own teachings, its own rhythms, its own invitations to deepen practice. To be a monk was to live not only in time but with time, to bow to the calendar not as a ruler but as a mirror. Spring arrived like a soft breath after a long meditation. The snows melted slowly, revealing patches of moss-covered earth and slender shoots pushing up through the ground. Plum trees blossomed first, their delicate white and pink petals standing out against the bare branches. Then came the cherries, their clouds of bloom turning entire courtyards pale and fragrant. For the monks, spring was a time of quiet joy, a gentle reminder of renewal, of beginnings, of the Buddha's birth celebrated during the Hanamatsuri or flower festival in early April. This was a sacred holiday, and although the monks celebrated it without extravagance, it held deep meaning. A small statue of the infant Buddha was placed in a flower-draped pavilion, and the monks poured sweet tea over it in a ritual of symbolic cleansing. Children from nearby villages might visit with their parents, dressed in simple finery, bringing blossoms and small offerings. The air was filled with fragrance and soft laughter, and yet within the temple, the monks maintained their discipline, observing the celebrations with a detached compassion, a witness to the impermanence even of joy. Spring also brought more work. Gardens needed tending, new vegetables were planted, and repairs were made to rooftops and wooden walkways damaged by winter's weight. The rains returned, gentle at first, then more insistent. The sound of water dripping from eaves became the soundtrack of the season. Everything seemed to breathe again, the earth, the trees, even the monks themselves. Morning meditations were held with doors open to the breeze, and the scent of fresh pine and moist soil mingled with the ever-present incense. The season taught patience, that growth could not be forced, only supported, and reminded the monks to begin again with gentleness. Summer brought intensity, of light, of heat, of effort. The days lengthened, the sun rose early, and the cicadas sang relentlessly, their high-pitched drone filling the forests like a wave. It was during summer that the monastery's discipline was often tested most sharply. Physical labor in the gardens and courtyards became taxing. The robes clung with sweat. Insects buzzed at every window. And yet life continued as before, the same schedule, the same stillness, the same inward gaze. This was part of the training. Comfort was not a guarantee. Equanimity, even in discomfort, was the path. One of the most important observances of the summer was Oban, a festival to honor the spirits of one's ancestors. While in the secular world it was often celebrated with lanterns, dances, and family reunions, within the monastery it took on a more solemn tone. Monks performed special chants and offerings, dedicating merit to all sentient beings, not just known ancestors, but those forgotten, lost, or wandering. The belief was that the veil between worlds thinned during this time, and that compassion could reach beyond death. Lanterns were sometimes floated down rivers, a ritual of release, of remembrance, of connection. As the days burned on and gave way to sudden evening storms, the monks learned to adjust. Meditation was often done with wet sleeves or under the faint hum of insects. Laundry was hung on bamboo poles and gathered quickly when the rains returned. Meals shifted with the season, incorporating more cucumbers, eggplants, and cold soups. The body adapted, and so did the mind. Summer taught endurance, but also surrender, a letting go of resistance, a willingness to sit in the heat and find stillness anyway. Autumn was perhaps the most poetic season in the monastic year. The air turned crisp, the skies grew clear and blue, and the mountains lit up with color, maple trees blazing red, ginkgo leaves turning gold. The world seemed to be on fire, and yet it was a fire of farewell, of beauty in the act of letting go. Monks took long kinhin walks through the temple grounds, practicing walking meditation as leaves crunched beneath their straw sandals. The light softened. Shadows lengthened. Everything pointed toward transience, the beauty that could only exist because it would soon vanish. This was the season of the Buddha's final teachings, commemorated in quiet ceremonies that emphasized impermanence and acceptance. Scrolls were read aloud that spoke of the parinirvana, the Buddha's death and release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. The monks bowed not in grief, but in gratitude. They did not mourn endings. They studied them. The falling leaf was not a symbol of loss, but of peace, the natural arc of all things fulfilled. Autumn also brought the harvest, squash, mushrooms, root vegetables, and chestnuts. Meals became warmer again, heartier but still simple. Fires were kindled more often in the kitchen, and the scent of roasting vegetables mixed with incense in the corridors. The rhythm of work slowed just a little. There was more time for reflection, for writing, for longer meditation sessions. The balance of inward and outward tipped toward the former. The season taught presence, to see clearly, to receive without clinging, to love without possession. Then came winter, quiet, cold, and clarifying. Snow blanketed the temple roofs and muffled every sound. The bells rang more softly in the frozen air. Footsteps became deliberate, placed carefully to avoid slipping on ice-covered paths. Monks wrapped themselves in heavier robes, their breath visible in the early morning chill. Fires were built in the meditation hall, but only just enough to take the edge off the cold. The practice remained unchanged. The stillness only deepened. Winter brought one of the most significant practices of the year, Rohatsa session, a 7-day retreat leading up to Bodhi Day, which commemorated the Buddha's enlightenment. During this week, the schedule intensified. Monks sat for hours each day in deep meditation, rising before dawn and continuing late into the night. Meals were minimal. Silence was absolute. Fatigue was inevitable. And yet, in this intensity, something opened. Insights arose. Tears were shed, not of sadness, but of clarity. The cold entered the bones and left behind understanding. The final day of the session was Bodhi Day, usually celebrated on the 8th of December. It was a time of quiet joy, not festivity. Monks gathered to chant, to reflect, and to bow. There might be a small treat, a rice cake or sweet tea, but the real celebration was inward. Enlightenment was not something distant or dramatic. It was already present, like the warmth hidden beneath layers of frost. The monks simply had to sit still long enough to feel it. Even outside the formal retreats, winter taught valuable lessons. How to move slowly, how to befriend solitude, how to find warmth in simplicity. Snow piled on the garden stones, covering even the most carefully placed arrangements. The garden did not resist. It rested. And so did the monks, not in idleness, but in deeper quiet. Journals were filled. Sutras were copied. Thoughts settled like the snow itself, softly, gently, until everything was still. Through all these seasons, the monks' robes remained the same. The chants were the same. The breath, the bow, the path, always the same. And yet, everything changed. This was the paradox and the promise of monastic life, that the unchanging discipline could hold space for infinite transformation. That in doing the same thing each day, one could become someone new, not by adding, but by shedding. Not by striving, but by yielding. The seasons came and went. The plum tree bloomed. The maple shed its leaves. The snow fell and melted again. And through it all, the monk watched, bowed, and practiced. He did not resist time. He walked with it, step by mindful step, until it was no longer separate from him, but part of his breath, his gaze, his very being. To live as a monk in medieval Japan was to walk a path shaped not by personal ambition, but by sacred commitment. At the heart of this life stood the vows, solemn promises that bound the monk not to rigid rules, but to a way of being. These vows were not made lightly, nor were they enforced with fear. They were accepted with humility, internalized with reverence, and lived with quiet discipline day after day, year after year. The vows were the bones of the monastic life, invisible, but essential, giving form and strength to everything else. The formal entrance into monastic life began with ordination, a ceremony known as takudo. Before this moment, a man might live at the temple as a postulant, participating in daily rituals and following the general routine. But ordination marked the turning point, a symbolic death to the lay life and a birth into the world of the Dharma. The ceremony was simple but powerful. The postulant knelt before the abbot, his head already shaved, his hands folded in gas show. In a clear, steady voice, he recited the 3 refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. With these words, he crossed a threshold. He was given his new name, often a spiritual or poetic reflection of his potential path, and his robes, known as kesa, were placed upon him. From that moment forward, he lived by the monastic code, known as the Vinaya or, in the Japanese context, adapted through the Brahmajala Sutra and the rules of specific sects like Tendai, Shingon, or Zen. These vows did not dictate what the monk believed, but how he lived, how he walked, spoke, ate, thought, and interacted with the world. At the core of the code were the 10 major precepts, each a doorway to ethical clarity. Do not take a life, to honor life in all its forms, from the largest creature to the smallest insect. Do not steal, to take only what is freely given and needed. Do not misuse sexuality. For monks, this meant celibacy, a complete renunciation of sensual indulgence. Do not lie, to speak only what is true, necessary, and kind. Do not intoxicate the body or mind, to avoid substances or behaviors that cloud awareness. Do not criticize others, to cultivate humility and compassion, not judgment. Do not praise oneself or slander others, to release the grip of ego and comparison. Do not be stingy, to live with generosity, sharing freely. Do not harbor ill will, to practice forgiveness, even when wronged. Do not abuse the three treasures, to uphold the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha with respect. Beyond these major precepts, many monks observed additional minor rules, sometimes hundreds, covering everything from how to wear one's robe to when to speak, where to sit, and how to greet others. These rules were not oppressive, but liberating. They removed uncertainty, cleared mental clutter, and allowed the monk to focus fully on the inner work of awakening. Every act became intentional. Even pouring tea or opening a door was done mindfully, in accordance with the vow to live ethically and attentively. Discipline, or shugyo, was not about harshness or self-denial. It was about returning, again and again, to the center. It was understood that the mind would wander, the body would grow tired, mistakes would be made. But the vow remained steady, like a stone in the stream. The monk's task was to realign himself gently, without self-punishment. To bow, to breathe, and begin again. Daily life reflected these vows in countless small ways. A monk walking down a forest path would step around an insect rather than crush it. He would bow to a visitor with full attention, never out of habit. If he felt anger rise in meditation, he did not suppress it or act on it, but observed it, named it, and allowed it to pass. In this way, the vows became not just rules, but mirrors, revealing the state of one's mind and pointing the way toward clarity. Monks were not isolated in their commitment. They lived and practiced in community, known as the Sangha, which was itself a vital part of the vow. To live with others was both a support and a challenge. Friction arose. Personalities clashed. But within the Sangha, these moments were not obstacles, they were practice. To listen patiently, to offer apology, to accept correction, these, too, were forms of renunciation. The monastery was not a haven from life, but a concentrated form of it. Every interaction became a chance to practice the precepts, to embody the vow more deeply. One of the clearest expressions of the vows came through robes. The monks' robes were plain, often brown, gray, or black, depending on the sect. They were sewn by hand, sometimes from discarded fabric, and worn layered in a specific way. The outer robe, the kesa, was treated with deep reverence. Monks folded it carefully, never letting it touch the ground. Donning it each morning was a ritual, a reminder of their path and a physical expression of humility. In appearance, all monks looked the same. The vow leveled hierarchy, concealed vanity, and pointed inward. Another powerful expression of the vow was celibacy. For the monk, this was not a rejection of love or affection, but a redirection of energy. By renouncing sensual attachment, he turned his attention toward universal compassion, toward a love unconditioned by desire. This vow freed the monk from the dramas of romance, family obligation, and worldly distraction. His relationships were based on kindness, presence, and non-possessiveness, a kind of love rarely seen, but deeply felt. Poverty was also part of the monastic commitment. Monks owned nothing beyond a few simple possessions: robes, a bowl, a pair of sandals, perhaps a brush and ink. Even the monastery itself was not owned by them, but entrusted to their care. This vow of non-possession fostered gratitude. Every object, a cup of tea, a warm blanket, a wooden staff, was received with reverence, used with care, and let go without clinging. The monk did not ask, "What do I have?" but rather, "What is needed?" And more often than not, the answer was, very little. There were moments of renewal built into monastic life. Periodically, monks would gather for confession and recommitment. They would kneel together, recite the precepts aloud, and acknowledge where they had fallen short. This was not a shaming ritual, but a release, a clearing of the slate, a return to the beginning. The vow was not a cage. It was a compass. And no matter how far one wandered, it always pointed home. Over the years, the vow became less of a rule and more of a rhythm. The monk no longer asked, "Should I speak this thought?" but simply remained quiet. He no longer debated whether to rise early, he simply did. His body, breath, and mind had been shaped by the vow until it no longer felt separate. It was not a thing he carried, but the way he walked. To the outside world, this might have looked like restriction. But to the monk, it was freedom. Freedom from chasing, from clinging, from fear. Freedom to sit still, to see clearly, to love without condition. The vow did not narrow his life. It deepened it. And so, as seasons passed and temples weathered, as hair turned gray and the hands grew calloused, the monk continued. He woke with the bell. He bowed to the Buddha. He swept the floor, stirred the pot, copied the sutra, sat in silence. Not because he had to, but because he had chosen to, once, long ago, and again each morning. The vow was not a moment. It was a lifetime. For all its calm rituals, harmonious gardens, and poetic silence, monastic life in medieval Japan was not without hardship, not the physical kind alone, but the emotional and spiritual challenges that stirred within. Beneath the surface of stillness, monks wrestled with questions that did not always have clear answers. They experienced doubt, restlessness, longing, and even despair. They faced the quiet turbulence of the self, amplified by the silence around them. And just as a mirror reflects whatever is placed before it, the monastic rhythm, slow, clear, and repetitive, reflected back the contents of their hearts in stark relief. Many monks, especially novices, entered the monastery carrying dreams. Some dreamed of peace, a life free from the chaos of war, poverty, or family duty. Others dreamed of transcendence, visions of enlightenment, spiritual power, or the serenity glimpsed in the face of an elder monk during meditation. And some arrived simply hoping to escape from grief, from guilt, from the noise of the world. The monastery welcomed them all, but it did not promise escape. What it offered was something far more difficult, a clear view of the mind. This clarity could be startling. In the early months of monastic life, a novice monk found himself confronted by silence not just around him, but within. The usual distractions of the world were gone, no entertainment, no idle chatter, no personal belongings to polish or protect. There was only breath, bowl, broom, and bell. And in that space, old thoughts surfaced. Regrets, memories, doubts, fears he hadn't named before. It was like watching dust swirl in a shaft of morning light, beautiful, but impossible to ignore. Many young monks, in those first seasons, asked the same unspoken questions. Am I worthy of this path? Will I ever find the stillness I see in others? What if I never reach awakening? These doubts were not signs of failure. They were part of the journey. In fact, some masters taught that doubt, gi, was one of the 3 essential conditions for deep insight, along with great effort and great faith. The key was not to eliminate doubt, but to observe it with the same clarity and detachment one brought to every other aspect of practice. Some monks experienced what was called the dark night of the mind, long periods where their practice felt hollow, their meditations restless, their faith shaken. They sat on the cushion for hours and felt nothing but leg pain and boredom. They chanted sutras with no resonance. They swept the same path, day after day, feeling no closer to truth. In these times, the monastery could feel less like a sanctuary and more like a mirror trap, reflecting back a self they did not yet understand. But the path of the robe was not designed for immediate reward. It was designed to wear away illusion, layer by quiet layer. The doubts did not destroy the monk, they humbled him. They softened his certainties. They stripped away the idea of spiritual progress as a ladder, and replaced it with something deeper, presence without expectation. Senior monks rarely addressed these struggles directly unless asked. Instead, they modeled the path. They offered quiet companionship, the wordless kind, where one simply shared space and breath. And when a younger monk finally asked, "What do I do with all this doubt?" an elder might reply only, "Return to the breath." No lengthy philosophy. Just the reminder, The path is walked one step at a time. Another form of inner struggle was desire, not just sensual desire, but the yearning for comfort, for approval, for identity. A monk might long for his family, remembering his mother's cooking or the sound of his father's voice. He might miss the freedom to roam, the joy of music, the warmth of a shared conversation. Even monks who had renounced everything sometimes felt envy, not of wealth or fame, but of ease. A passing traveler in a warm coat. A child with no duties. A bird singing with no obligation to wake at 4 a.m. These moments were not shunned. They were seen as natural ripples in the mind. The goal was not to suppress them, but to observe without clinging. The monk did not fight the longing. He sat with it, breathed with it, bowed to it, and eventually, like fog over a pond, it lifted. There were also dreams, vivid and strange. Dreams of the past, of family members long gone. Dreams of floating above the monastery, of losing one's robes, of chanting underwater. Some dreams brought insight, others confusion. A monk might dream of speaking with the Buddha, only to wake in tears, the meaning just out of reach. Dreams were never discussed lightly. They were written down, pondered, sometimes brought to a teacher. But the message was always the same: do not grasp at dreams, even the beautiful ones. Let them come and go like wind through pine needles. For some, the deepest struggle came not from doubt or desire, but from a loss of direction. After years of practice, after thousands of bows and breaths, they began to wonder, what now? What is all this for? If enlightenment is not a flash of light or a divine voice, how will I know I've found it? To these monks, teachers would often share the parable of the ox herder. In this classic Zen story, a man searches for an ox, representing the true self, and gradually moves from finding its tracks to seeing its tail, then its body, and finally taming and riding it. In the last image, the man returns to the world, barefoot and smiling, having realized that the search was not to gain something new, but to awaken to what had always been there. The point was not to escape suffering, but to meet it with awareness. Even seasoned monks were not immune to restlessness. An elder might suddenly find himself questioning the rituals he had followed for decades. He might wonder if he had truly understood the teachings. He might look at the young novices and feel both admiration and melancholy, remembering his own early hopes and how differently life had unfolded. In those moments, he returned to the practice, not out of habit, but out of faith, not the faith of certainty, but the faith of staying. The monastery itself was built to hold these struggles. Its silence did not press down, it held space. Its rituals did not demand perfection, they offered rhythm. The garden welcomed sadness as easily as joy. The floorboards bore the weight of every faltering step. And the bell, when it rang, reminded everyone, beginner and master alike, to return to the present moment. There were no punishments for struggling, only reminders to stay engaged. A monk who fell asleep during meditation was nudged gently. A monk who skipped chores out of apathy was reassigned to sweep the same path, again and again, until something shifted. And when words failed, there was always tea, poured slowly, sipped in silence, presence restored one cup at a time. Over time, the inner storms calmed. Not because they disappeared, but because the monk no longer tried to outrun them. He allowed himself to feel sorrow without drowning in it. He laughed at his own restlessness. He no longer chased awakening like a destination, but welcomed it in the curve of a leaf, the warmth of soup, the creak of a door in the night. And when the doubt returned, as it always did, he did not see it as failure. He bowed to it, sat with it, let it teach him again. Because in truth, the struggles were not distractions from the path. They were the path. A monk who had once feared his thoughts now watched them pass like clouds. A monk who had once dreamed of enlightenment now folded his robes with contentment. A monk who had once questioned whether he belonged now walked the garden path each morning as if it were the only path in the world, and in some small way, it was. Thus, the life of a monk was not perfect. It was not always peaceful. But it was real, honest, held gently by the bell, the breath, and the bowl. And in the quiet struggle to stay, to sit through doubt, to bow through boredom, to chant through longing, something unshakable was found. Not a truth that could be spoken, but a way of living that needed no words. Though most who entered the monastery in medieval Japan remained within its walls until death, not all monks spent their entire lives in quiet seclusion. Some, after years of dedicated practice, left the monastery. Not in rebellion or failure, but as a continuation of their path. These men, shaped by stillness and guided by vows, stepped once more into the world not as ordinary travelers, but as living extensions of the Dharma. Their departure was not the end of monastic life, it was its unfolding in another form. In Buddhist tradition, renunciation was never meant to be a prison. The precepts were commitments, not chains. And while the monastery was a powerful container for awakening, it was never the only place where awakening could happen. A monk who had spent years tending the garden, copying sutras, and bowing in silence might one day rise and know, quietly, clearly, that it was time to bring the Dharma beyond the temple gate. Such monks were often given a blessing by their teacher or abbot. There was no dramatic farewell, no speech, no parade. Perhaps just a final tea shared in silence, a bow exchanged in the main hall, and a folded set of robes carefully packed. A monk might leave to tend to a dying parent, to teach in a small village that had no temple, or to wander as a mendicant, a traveling monk with no fixed abode, practicing wherever he happened to be. These wandering monks, or unsui, literally, clouds and water, drifted like their namesakes, unattached, light, responsive. They carried with them a few possessions, a staff, a bowl, a bundle of robes. They slept beneath trees, in roadside shelters, or in the homes of kind villagers. They ate what was offered. They spoke when spoken to. And they shared their presence as their offering, a calm smile, a listening ear, a simple chant under the stars. Some joined smaller temples, becoming abbots or teachers in their own right. These temples might be nestled in remote valleys, serving only a handful of villagers, or perched near busy roads where travelers paused for reflection. In these roles, former monks brought the rhythm of the great monasteries into humbler settings, adapting teachings to the needs of farmers, mothers, merchants, and children. Their days were filled not just with chanting and meditation, but with questions, laughter, rice planting, and funeral rites. A few returned to the secular world, though rarely as they had left it. Some resumed lives of lay devotion, continuing to practice daily meditation and ethical living while raising families or working the fields. Others became teachers or healers, known not for their eloquence but for their stillness. They offered no titles. They wore no special robes. But those who met them felt something, a quiet depth, a steadiness, a gaze that seemed to see through the noise. Even those who left with less clarity, who struggled, who questioned, who drifted, were not judged. The path of awakening was long, winding, and deeply personal. A monk who returned to the world did not erase his practice. He carried it within him, whether he remembered it or not. The vows, once taken, remained like seeds, dormant perhaps, but alive. Letters sometimes passed between these monks and their old temples, hand-copied notes of gratitude, poems of longing, or humble questions about a dream, a difficulty, a moment of doubt. The abbot would read them by lantern light, smile softly, and reply with care. The monastery was not possessive. Its gates were open both ways, and the sangha extended beyond its walls. There are stories, still told today, of monks who returned after many years, older, thinner, eyes brighter with the kind of wisdom that only comes from walking both the quiet path and the crowded one. They did not speak much. They needed no introduction. A younger monk would bow to them without knowing why. And they would sit once more on the meditation cushion, not to relearn, but to continue, as if no time had passed at all. Sometimes, a traveling monk would visit a town during a season of grief, after a bad harvest, a fire, or a death that shook the community. He would not offer sermons. He would simply sit in the square, or walk the fields, or accept a bowl of rice in silence. And something in his presence, calm, grounded, kind, would ease the sorrow. People did not need to understand the teachings. They felt them. In this way, the teachings of the monastery flowed back into the world. Not in words alone, but in gestures, choices, tone, and presence. A monk who had left the temple might show a child how to sweep with intention, might sit with an elder through a sleepless night, might mend a broken gate without being asked. These small acts, unnoticed by most, became echoes of the practice. And one day, when the road had grown long and the body tired, such a monk might return once more to his original temple, or another quiet place. He might take up a broom, join in evening chanting, or simply sit in the garden, watching the wind move through the reeds. There would be no ceremony, no need for explanation. He had never truly left. Because the monastery was not a place. It was a way of walking, a way of being. And once learned, it never truly faded. Within the serene, disciplined life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan, teaching was not confined to lectures, sermons, or academic instruction. Instead, it flowed like water, subtly, silently, and with great depth. Much of what a monk learned came not through written texts or formal classes, but through observation, imitation, and presence. Wisdom was passed down not just through ideas, but through the way a senior monk walked, bowed, served tea, or swept the floor. In this environment, teaching without words was not only possible, it was essential. At the heart of this silent transmission stood the relationship between student and teacher, or disciple and master. In Zen Buddhism, this was more than a hierarchy. It was a sacred bond called shishodeshi, rooted in trust, humility, and shared purpose. The teacher was not a guru demanding obedience, nor a professor dispensing facts, but a living embodiment of the Dharma. His task was not to give answers, but to awaken questions. His power lay not in charisma, but in clarity. He taught not just what to think, but how to look. This teaching began the moment a novice arrived at the temple. No formal welcome was offered, no orientation given. Instead, the novice was expected to observe, to watch how the elders behaved, how they moved through space, how they responded to challenge or success. Every gesture was a lesson: how to hold a broom, how to fold robes, how to bow before the altar. Nothing was explained unless asked. Silence encouraged awareness. The unspoken expectation was, be still, pay attention, and you will learn everything you need to know. This did not mean the novice was left to struggle alone. Senior monks, known as anji or spiritual guides, were always present, patient, observant, and ready to intervene if a novice fell into harmful patterns. But they guided subtly. If the novice forgot to bow properly, the guide might simply pause beside him in silence, allowing the weight of the moment to teach. If he rushed through his tasks, the guide might assign a simpler one, sweeping the same path again, until he slowed naturally. These corrections were rarely verbal, but deeply felt. Each monk, in time, was paired with a formal teacher, sometimes the abbot of the temple, other times a designated mentor. This relationship was deeply personal and long-lasting. The teacher did not hover or micromanage. He watched. He asked precise questions at unexpected times. He assigned koans, paradoxical riddles like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Not to be solved, but to stretch the mind into new shapes. And most of all, he modeled the path by walking it himself. Lineage was central to this process. Monks were not isolated seekers. They were part of a living chain of transmission stretching back to the historical Buddha. Each master had a teacher, and that teacher had one before him, forming an unbroken line called the Kechimyaku. This lineage was recorded carefully in temple scrolls and recited during ceremonies. To belong to a lineage was not a boast, but a responsibility, a reminder that one's practice was part of something much larger, and that the teachings were not possessions but gifts, passed down with reverence. Transmission of the Dharma, known as Inka Shomiyan Zen, was the formal acknowledgement that a disciple had truly grasped the essence of the teachings. This did not happen often, and never quickly. It required years, sometimes decades, of silent practice, study, and relationship. The ceremony itself was quiet and profound. No grand declarations. Just a private meeting between teacher and student, where a few words were exchanged, or perhaps none at all. The master would pass on a certificate, perhaps a robe or a bowl, symbolizing the passing of wisdom. The student, now a teacher, continued the line, not as a new authority, but as another humble servant of the path. One of the most powerful ways this silent teaching manifested was through modeling behavior in everyday tasks. In Zen monasteries, there is a well-known story of a great master who always cleaned the toilets himself, even though he had dozens of disciples. When asked why, he replied, "Because it needs doing." The message was clear: no task is beneath the monk, and every action, if done with mindfulness, is a teaching. The tenzo, or head cook, often became an unexpected mentor to young monks. According to Dogen, one of the most revered Zen masters in Japan, the kitchen was where the Dharma was most clearly embodied. A cook who chopped vegetables with presence, who stirred the pot with care, who offered meals with gratitude, this person taught more than any lecture could. The kitchen became a school, not of theory, but of attention. Occasionally, a teacher would offer a formal Dharma talk, known as a tea-show. These talks were not casual. The monks sat in full robes, straight-backed, listening without question or comment. The teacher's words were few but deep, often beginning with a koan or sutra verse and expanding into a reflection on its meaning. But even then, the real teaching lay not in the words, but in the space between them, in the tone, the pauses, the eyes of the teacher as he spoke. What mattered most was not what was said, but what was felt. Humility was a key lesson passed down through these unspoken teachings. A monk who sought praise or status was gently corrected. A monk who acted with pride was reminded of impermanence, perhaps asked to sweep the cremation grounds or care for an ill elder. Service was the antidote to ego, and every teacher knew this well. In the monastery, the highest honor was not to lead, but to serve, to embody the teachings without needing recognition. There were times when the teachings came through paradox or surprise. A master might shout suddenly during meditation, clap his hands loudly, or overturn a tea bowl, not in anger, but as a way to jolt the student out of conceptual thinking. These moments, known as katsu, were shocking but effective. They disrupted the student's habitual mind, forcing him to see the present moment directly. These actions were not explained. The student had to sit with them, reflect, and let understanding arise naturally. For those who were ready, private interviews, or dokusen, were offered. During these sessions, a student met alone with the teacher in a small, quiet room. He might present a koan, ask a question, or simply sit in silence. The teacher would respond directly, sometimes kindly, sometimes sharply, always precisely. These encounters could change a student's path. A single word, a raised eyebrow, a pause, all could carry the weight of years of practice. Not all lessons were mystical or dramatic. Many were mundane. A teacher might walk beside a student and ask, "What did you see today that you didn't see yesterday?" Or he might hand the student a broom and say, "Clean until the broom is happy." These simple instructions carried layers of meaning. They trained the monk to look closely, to feel his tools, to listen deeply. They taught that wisdom was not hidden, it was right in front of him, waiting to be seen. Over time, the young monk absorbed the teachings not as facts, but as ways of being. He bowed when his teacher entered the room, not out of duty, but out of respect. He sat upright in meditation, not from discipline alone, but because it felt right. He spoke with care, walked with calm, and met each task with attention, not because he was told to, but because he had seen it lived. And when his teacher grew old, his hands trembling as he wrote, his steps slow on the temple path, the student served him without resentment. He helped him dress, carried his bowl, and listened to his soft words with reverence. In this service he learned the final teaching, that all things pass, and that the true transmission of the Dharma lies not in scrolls or certificates, but in the way one lives, breathes, and bows. Though cloistered high in the mountains or tucked into the quiet outskirts of towns, monasteries in medieval Japan were never completely isolated from the world beyond their gates. While monks led lives of renunciation, discipline, and spiritual inwardness, they were not hermits removed from humanity. Rather, the monastery existed in a dynamic and meaningful relationship with lay people, farmers, artisans, nobles, pilgrims, merchants, and the curious. These visitors, whether they came for a day or a lifetime, were part of the monastic story, and their presence offered monks a chance to practice compassion, humility, and non-attachment in the presence of others. The relationship between the monastery and lay society was one of mutual support. The lay people provided alms, food, labor, and funding. In turn, the monks offered teachings, blessings, and a model of the Dharma in action. This exchange was not transactional, but spiritual, a reflection of interdependence. Just as a tree needs the soil and the sun, so too did the monastery rely on the broader community to survive, and the community relied on the monastery to thrive inwardly. One of the most common forms of interaction came through almsgiving, known as takuhatsu. In some monasteries, especially those influenced by early Chinese Chan practices or strict Zen lineages, monks would leave the temple and walk barefoot through the surrounding villages with large alms bowls in hand. Heads bowed slightly, eyes lowered, robes flowing, they moved in silence, one slow, deliberate step at a time. They did not beg with words, nor did they make demands. Their presence alone was the offering. Those who wished to give would place rice, vegetables, or coins into the bowl, a gesture of generosity and respect. This ritual was not about acquiring food. It was about humbling the monk and honoring the layperson's role in the path. The monk learned gratitude and trust. The villager learned the joy of giving. Both were practicing the Dharma together, in different roles, but equal importance. Many lay people visited monasteries directly, especially during festivals, harvests, or times of personal crisis. They came seeking comfort, answers, blessings, or simply a glimpse of the peace that the monastic life seemed to embody. Some came to offer prayers for the dead. Others brought children to be blessed, or left offerings in gratitude for a safe journey or a healed illness. The temple grounds, often open to the public during daylight hours, served as a spiritual anchor for the entire region. When visitors arrived, they were greeted not with fanfare, but with simple hospitality. A designated monk might lead them through the outer courtyard, offer tea in the guest hall, or show them to the main altar for prayer. If the visitor came with grief, a monk might sit beside them in silence, letting their presence offer more comfort than words. If the visitor was wealthy or of noble rank, the monks remained neutral, treating them with respect, but not deference. In the monastery, all were equal in the face of impermanence. Children were often a lively, if momentary, presence. Sometimes they came during festivals, wide-eyed and whispering as they passed monks in the hallways. The younger novices, barely older than some of the visiting boys, watched them with a mix of nostalgia and detachment. To live among monks meant not forgetting childhood, but letting it go with kindness. Some lay people stayed longer, a day, a week, even months. Known as lay practitioners or Upasatha visitors, they lived according to simplified monastic rules while within the temple. They woke early, ate sparingly, meditated, and helped with chores. Some were elderly, seeking peace in the final chapter of life. Others were young men considering ordination. Their presence added a quiet diversity to the monastery, a gentle reminder of the world beyond, and the many forms that practice could take. These lay guests slept in separate quarters, but they shared meals and ceremonies with the monks. They often wore plain robes, not to mimic the monks, but to align with the spirit of simplicity. Monks treated them with kindness, but did not overly engage. Each guest was encouraged to find their own rhythm, to ask questions only when necessary, and to observe more than they spoke. Teaching the laity was another important role. In some temples, the abbot or senior monks gave Dharma talks on the full moon or on special holy days. These teachings were open to the public, often held in the main hall or an open pavilion. Villagers would gather on straw mats, children perched on laps or tugging at sleeves, while the monks spoke in a low, deliberate tone about suffering, compassion, or the fleeting nature of life. He might use parables, everyday images, a withered flower, a cracked bowl, the change in seasons, to make the teachings accessible. These talks were rarely recorded or transcribed. Their value lay not in repetition, but in presence. Those who listened left not with doctrines, but with a softened heart, a new way of looking at an old problem, a breath of peace they could carry into their daily toil. The monk taught not to impress, but to relieve, to offer a small refuge in a world often marked by hardship. Wealthy patrons, including samurai lords and noble families, sometimes sponsored temples, providing land, funds, or rare items such as scrolls, statues, or incense. This support was essential, but carefully balanced. Monks were taught to accept offerings without attachment, and without flattery. They bowed in gratitude, not submission. The monastery did not exist to curry favor or influence. It existed to serve the Dharma. And even the highest-ranking lord was reminded that his power ended at the gates of impermanence. In times of natural disaster, earthquakes, floods, famines, the monastery often became a place of refuge. Monks opened their doors to the displaced, offered rice and warmth, and treated the suffering with quiet dignity. They could not solve every problem, nor did they try. But their calm, their order, and their compassion provided a kind of spiritual triage, a reminder that peace was possible even in the midst of loss. Pilgrims formed another part of the lay connection. Some came from far-off provinces, traveling on foot for days to reach a revered temple. These visitors often wore straw hats and rough robes, carrying walking sticks and prayer beads. They came to bow before a statue, to light incense, to leave behind sorrow or give thanks for a blessing. Monks welcomed them with the same simplicity as they did all others, offering water, rest, and space to reflect. Not all lay interactions were ideal. There were moments of misunderstanding, of tension. A visitor might expect miracles. A patron might make unreasonable demands. A wandering ascetic might challenge the monastery's structure. But in each case, the monk practiced patience. He remembered his vows. He responded not with resistance, but with stillness. These moments, too, were part of the training, to remain grounded even when the world outside trembled. Over time, many monks came to see the presence of laypeople not as a disruption, but as a gift. They were reminders of the suffering that continued outside the monastery walls, and of the compassion that monks were called to embody. A monk might spend years in solitude, but one kind exchange with a grieving mother, one cup of tea offered to a tired pilgrim, could illuminate the path more clearly than 1,000 hours of study. Thus, the monastery and the world remained in quiet orbit around each other, distinct yet connected. The monks lived within, the lay people without, but both were bound by breath, by struggle, by hope. The monastery was not an escape. It was a center. And from that center, a great stillness rippled outward, reaching homes, fields, markets, and hearts far beyond the temple grounds. And the monk, returning to his seat in the meditation hall, bowed once more, not only to the Buddha, but to the unseen world beyond the gate. A world of imperfection, noise, and need, and a world that, like the temple itself, was worthy of deep and boundless compassion. In the life of a Buddhist monk in medieval Japan, death was not feared, resisted, or avoided. It was studied, reflected on, bowed to, not as a grim specter, but as the final teaching, the last and most honest chapter in the scroll of life. From the moment a monk took his vows, he lived with the knowledge that all things, including himself, would pass. And so, when death approached, he did not run from it. He met it with stillness, like a leaf drifting to the ground in autumn, no longer clinging to the branch, no longer pretending it would last forever. Monks were taught early on to meditate on impermanence, or mujo. The world was in constant motion. Flowers bloomed and wilted, buildings aged and crumbled, seasons turned without pause. Even the body, so carefully disciplined and purified, would one day falter. Illness would come. Breath would slow. The senses would dim. And yet, none of this was tragic. It was simply the truth. And because it was the truth, it could be embraced, not with fear, but with peace. Elder monks often spoke of death not with sadness, but with soft reverence. They had seen it many times: a brother collapsing during zazen, a mentor growing thinner by the season, a friend bowing one last time before retreating to his bed. And each time they learned again that practice was not about achieving enlightenment before death, but about learning how to die well, with clarity, with gratitude, with nothing left to grasp. As a monk aged, his duties often shifted. His steps grew slower, his work lighter, his meditation deeper. He might take on the role of a teacher, a mentor, a quiet presence in the background who had no need to speak unless invited. The younger monks watched him closely, not out of obligation, but out of admiration. There was something about the way he moved, the way he listened, the way he smiled without reason, that spoke more powerfully than any sutra. When illness came, whether sudden or gradual, the monk did not complain. He accepted the pain as he had accepted discomfort in meditation, rain in the garden, or hunger during fasting. If he could no longer sit cross-legged, he lay down mindfully. If he could no longer chant, he listened. If he could no longer serve, he received. And even in receiving, he practiced gratitude, patience, humility. There were rituals to prepare for death, but none were elaborate. A monk who sensed his time drawing near might ask to be moved to a quieter space, a small room near the temple garden, where he could see the sky or hear the wind in the bamboo. He might request incense, a simple statue of the Buddha, and the presence of a few close companions. He did not cling to family, possessions, or unfinished business. The monastic life had been one long preparation for this moment, a slow releasing of ties, a gradual softening of the self. Often, the monk would continue meditating until the final hours. Some died in the lotus position, seated upright, eyes half closed, breath slowing into silence. Others passed in bed, their heads gently propped up, their hands in gas show. If he was able, the dying monk might whisper the name of the Buddha, or recite a favorite verse. But more often, there was no need for words. His life had already spoken them. The Sangha, the monastic community, gathered when death was near. They did not weep or wail. They sat. They chanted softly. They bowed. One monk might offer tea to the dying brother, though it would go untouched. Another might gently wipe his brow. The atmosphere was not grim. It was calm, as if the entire temple were exhaling together. There was grief, yes, but it was not heavy. It was spacious, touched with the understanding that nothing had been lost, only returned. When the monk passed, his body was washed with warm water, dressed in clean robes, and placed in a simple pine coffin or wrapped in cloth. The funeral ceremony, or sogi, was marked by chanting, incense, and eulogies spoken by fellow monks. These were not glowing praises, but honest reflections. He was quiet. He swept the path carefully. He once smiled at me when I was lost in doubt. These small details became sacred, the evidence of a life lived with care. Cremation followed, in keeping with Buddhist custom. The fire was tended by monks, not strangers. Ashes were placed in an urn and enshrined, either on temple grounds or returned to the family if requested. But the focus was never on the remains. It was on the continuation. The teachings, the presence, the small acts of kindness, these lived on in those who had known him. The name of the deceased monk was sometimes changed posthumously, given a kaimyo, a name that reflected his spiritual path. This name was inscribed on a memorial tablet and kept on the temple altar. On certain days, the anniversary of his death, the equinox, or oban, his name would be read aloud, incense offered, and the Sangha would bow again. Not because he needed remembrance, but because the act of remembering shaped the living. For the younger monks, the death of an elder was a moment of reflection. What would they leave behind? Not in possessions or accomplishments, but in presence. Would their silence offer comfort? Would their actions teach others long after words had faded? The elder monk had not chased greatness. He had simply risen, bowed, sat, served, and surrendered. And in doing so, he had become a teaching. In rare cases, a dying monk might leave behind a written reflection, a eulogy or death poem. These were not dramatic. They were haiku-like in spirit, brief, spare, rooted in nature. One might write, "The plum blossoms fall. Even the wind that carried them has gone quiet now." Such words were not meant to be profound. They were meant to be true, to speak plainly of the moment, to honor the fleeting beauty of breath, of form, of being. Some monks, knowing the end was near, withdrew entirely. They would leave the monastery, climb a familiar mountain trail, and sit beneath a favorite tree or beside a stream. There, in solitude, they would breathe their last, not as an escape, but as a return. To the earth, to silence, to the Dharma that had shaped them. But most stayed among their brothers, allowing themselves to be cared for, to be held gently by the very community they had once served. And in that final surrender, they completed the circle, student becoming teacher, giver becoming receiver, life becoming death. And the monastery continued. The bell rang the next morning. The rice was cooked. The floor was swept. A new novice bowed at the gate. And somewhere in the rhythm of those ordinary acts, in the rustle of robes, the flicker of a candle, the whisper of a chant, the presence of the departed monk remained. Not as a ghost or memory, but as part of the path itself. Because in the end, a monk did not leave a monument. He left a way. And so, we leave behind the quiet halls, the mist-covered mountains, and the soft footsteps of those who walked the path of the robe and bull. Their days were not loud, their names rarely known. Yet, in the stillness of their lives, there was something lasting, something deeper than titles or monuments. There was a rhythm of waking, bowing, breathing, and letting go. A way of being that asked nothing of the world, yet offered everything. In their silence, they taught us to listen. In their simplicity, they reminded us of what truly matters. And in their gentle passing, they left behind not emptiness, but a presence, the quiet echo of a life well lived. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this journey brought you peace, reflection, or rest, you're welcome to return anytime. And if you feel drawn to more quiet stories from the past, feel free to subscribe, but only if it feels right. I'm simply grateful you were here. Until next time, may your breath be soft, your thoughts light, and your path gentle. Good night.